Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind Headlines, and in this programme tonight we shall be discussing, is Britain now in the hands of the Islamists? As our former Home Secretary Suella Braverman writes in the Daily Telegraph, she says the following, that the Islamists, the extremists and the anti-Semites are in charge now, and they've bullied the Labour Party. They have bullied our institutions and have now bullied our country into submission. And we'll be asking, is there a correlation between the rise of Islamic extremism in this country and the rise of Jew hatred that we've seen as a pandemic ever since the horrific events in Israel on October the 7th? And could we be entering into the season of the hunters? Regan, it's great to see you on Behind Headlines as we unpack this very important topic. It looks like, as Richard Littlejohn, writing in the Daily Mail, has said, that our institutions, whether it's Parliament, whether it's the police, whether it's our government, has given into the Islamic mob, and we're seeing that they're flexing their muscles as they see that the police are doing nothing to stop the rise of Jew hatred, to stop these incitements to genocides on our streets in London and throughout our major cities.
We have fireworks being set off, graffiti being sprayed, chants of genocide, heinous posters depicting stereotypical hate images of Jews. We have people giving Hitler salutes. We have people vandalizing properties owned by Jews, restaurants that are run by Israelis, people who have nothing to do even with the situation just because they're Jewish, being targeted by vile, borderline lynch mobs of individuals who are seeking to create absolute havoc, leaving many of Britain's Jews feeling extremely vulnerable, suffering in their mental health. The horrifying, sharp, steep rise in anti-Semitic attacks since October the 7th. Most of those recorded before any Israeli response, before any Israeli military offensive in Gaza, the vast bulk coming within the first 2 weeks after October the 7th, is leaving people in the Jewish community, whether they are Orthodox, whether they are practicing any form of Judaism, or whether they're just ethnically Jewish, totally reeling. And this is a blight on our nation.
And of course, our Jewish community feels scared. They feel very threatened with this alarming rise of Jew hatred in this country. Islamists have, according to our former Foreign Secretary Suella Braverman, harassed teachers through the courts, turned our human rights and equality laws against us. They threatened to murder a Conservative MP, Mike Freer, who has quit public office. They've taken over a by-election in Rochdale that's going to take place on Thursday this week, and it looks like the only candidate that's going to win is an Islamic fundamentalist, George Galloway.
Yeah, you have two choices. Your choice is between two anti-Semites.
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah, but George Galloway and the suspended Labour Party candidate who's no longer in the Labour Party. So it's practically gifted George Galloway, unless there's a miracle divine intervention here, it's practically gifted the election there to George Galloway.
Absolutely. We've also seen the Islamic influence over our judiciary, over our legal professions, and also our universities. And last week we saw that Parliament was hijacked over a vote calling for a ceasefire in Israel's war against Hamas that has really brought Parliament into disrepute. We've seen awful light shows on Parliament with Free Gaza and pro-Palestinian slogans beamed right across Parliament, as well as taking, for example, as London Bridge hostage with the Palestinian protesters mob. So, yeah, we will be asking, is there a direct correlation between what is essentially a pandemic in the rise of Jew hatred in this country, the highest recording instances on record since October the 7th, and this rise of Islamism we're seeing today? And of course, how does this fit in terms of Jeremiah 16 verses 16 to 24, talking about the season of the hunters? First I'll send out the fishermen, and then I'll send out the hunters. So essentially what we're seeing, I think, Reagan, is that our democracy and our freedom and our liberties that previous generations have sacrificed in their blood for, we're now on the verge of losing because we're failing to stand up to Jew hatred. We are failing to protect our Jewish community, and now our very institutions are threatened.
Now, many people will want to know the exact particulars and the statistics. Is this something that is tangibly evident in a statistical way? Absolutely. The Community Security Trust, which provides security for the British Jewish community at a range of Jewish events. They provide security for synagogues, an amazing volunteer task force and initiative within Jewish communities keeping them safe, have released their annual academic report into reported incidents of anti-Semitism in the UK for 2023. And I should say that it is reported incidents. There are many, very many, who will not be reporting some of the lesser incidents of anti-Semitism that they face because they don't see the point or they don't feel anything will be done about it. The CST recorded 4,103 anti-Semitic incidents in the UK in 2023. It's the highest total ever reported to CST in a single calendar year. It's an increase of 147% from the 1,662 anti-Jewish hate incidents recorded by CST in 2022, is 81% higher than the previous annual record of 2,261 incidents reported in 2021. CST recorded 1,684 anti-Semitic incidents in 2020 and 1,813 in 2019. Now, the record total is due to the sheer volume of anti-Semitism perpetrated across the UK immediately following Hamas's attack on 7th of October 2023 across southern Israel. Of the 4,103 incidents of anti-Jewish hate reported, 2,699, that's 66%, occurred on or after the 7th of October. And this figure alone exceeds any previous annual anti-Semitic incident total recorded by CST, marking a rise of 589% from the 392 instances of anti-Semitism reported to CST over the same time period there in October in 2022.
Shocking, isn't it? Ever since October the 7th occurred, the biggest mass terrorist attack in Israel's history, the largest number of Jews murdered since the Holocaust, that was over 80 years ago, and we're having these statistics in this country, clearly shows that this country is no longer safe for Jewish people, which is tragic considering that the Jewish people make up a vast component of our Judeo-Christian society, and without our Jewish population as a nation, we're nothing. And so to feel what they're going through ever since October the 7th is almost like a principality or some demonic spirit has been unleashed upon the world, not only in Israel, but upon the world, as we see that Jewish communities now are being threatened. But the figures are extraordinary. I mean, if we see one of the reports here, according to the Security Community Trust, the previous record monthly totals for 2021 and in 2024 and 2009 reflect spikes in anti-Jewish hate observed at times when Israel was at war during those years. While it's also true of the unprecedented surge in anti-Semitism reported in 2023, there is one key difference this time. Anti-Semitic incidents skyrocketed in the immediate aftermath of a terror attack, responsible for the highest death toll on any day since the Holocaust, before Israel had coordinated a substantive military response. They go on to say the speed at which the anti-Semites mobilised in the UK following Hamas's attack shows that initially, at least, the significant increase in anti-Jewish hate was, if anything, a celebration of Hamas, a massacre by people whose own hatred was emboldened in their minds, legitimised by the brutality enacted on civilians in southern Israel.
The very first incident inspired by Hamas's attack was reported to CST at 12:55 p.m. on the 7th of October, when a vehicle drove past a synagogue in Hertfordshire with a Palestinian flag attached, windows wound down, and an occupant shaking their fist in the air towards the synagogue. Of course, this was on Simchat Torah, which was a holy day that commemorates God's giving of the Torah to the Jews. It was also a Sabbath, a normal Sabbath as well, and this is occurring right outside a synagogue only hours after the news began to break of the heinous attacks by Hamas on that day. By the morning of the 9th of October, Free Palestine graffiti was sprayed on a bridge in Golders Green in the heart of one of London's largest Jewish communities. There you have it right there, Free Palestine, it says. In total, 31 anti-Semitic incidents were reported to CST on 7th of October. The figure rose further over the coming days, peaking on the 11th of October with 80 cases of anti-Jewish hate reported, the highest incident total for any single day ever recorded by CST. What does Golders Green have to do with the attacks on the 7th of October? If this is not a claim to support what Hamas did before Israel has even gone in and cleared out fully the infiltration of Hamas terrorists. It took almost a week to accomplish that. We were seeing news reports even of soldiers who were trying to go into places like Sderot and other spots to make sure it was cleared. It took several days. So Free Palestine, Golders Green Bridge, we know what that's about. It's a direct call for genocide, and it's pointing at the Jews who are there, saying, "We got you."
Yeah, it's a celebration of Hamas. It's a celebration of the biggest mass terrorist attack in Israel's history, and of course, you and I have been down, and we've seen the devastation committed by Hamas with our own eyes, particularly at Kibbutz Nir Oz and the car park with 1,300 cars shot to bits. We met locals, we'd heard personal accounts. So this is actually in celebration of that.
The night of the 7th of October, I was watching and seeing how, this was always going to happen. It was a foregone conclusion that this was going to happen. You understand the climate that we live in and how it works. We've seen this happen before, as we read there in 2021, 2014, and 2009. But before any response has been offered, while there are still bodies smoldering, there were people giving up baklava, teas, and dancing in the streets of Edgware Road, literally just a mile from where I live. So here's the graph of it, 3,328 instances of abusive behavior, 22 incidents where anti-Semitic literature has been handed out, 266 assaults, 182 incidents of damage and desecration, and 305 threats. It's just...
And that is reported instances. So let's get this in perspective. Yeah. This is reported instances of anti-Semitism. This is not the true figure, because no doubt the true figure will be even higher, which does show and suggest the sorry state of affairs that our nation is living. And of course then the role that social media is playing in all of this. We can see here instances on social media platforms. A total of 1,282 instances of anti-Semitism.
And this is in the UK. We have to remark, it's what's reported, and it's in the UK. You widen the horizon, it's an impossible number to deal with.
No, absolutely. I'd even describe the last week's Middle East report I've recorded with a good friend of ours, Pastor Jeff Quazzo, and having read the comments on kind of YouTube, comparing it to Nazi propaganda and comparing us to the Third Reich.
And Jeff.
No, I'm sure, because we're discussing Israel, discussing the events surrounding October the 7th. I mean, and again, you would say that this is the kind of anti-Semitic vitriol that the Jewish people are facing, and it's like the victim becomes the oppressor, and the oppressor becomes the victim. So let's classify the Jewish people, let's classify the state of Israel as a Nazi state, even though the Nazis mass murdered on an industrial scale the Jewish people, and it's making that more equivalence between Israel and the Nazis, or anyone who dares to speak up on behalf of Israel, the Nazis, when it's those who are perpetuating these lies actually reflect the same ideology as the Nazis, as they have the same spirit that drives them.
Writing in the Daily Telegraph, the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman has claimed that Islamists are bullying Britain into submission. This isn't just about my colleagues in Parliament. Our values and freedoms are under attack in all walks of life. She writes, they started with the Jews. There were stern words of disapproval from the top, but things only got worse. The Islamist cranks and left-wing extremists then took control of the streets. The police looked meekly on. They harassed teachers through the courts. Our human rights and equalities laws were used against us. They threatened to kill an MP. He decided justifiably to leave public life. A respected peer, Lord Alston, spoke out against terrorism and Islamism. He was suspended from a job he loves. They've hijacked a by-election in a deprived town in northern England. We see their influence in our judiciary, our legal profession, and our universities. And then they came for Parliament. On a day when Keir Starmer should have shown strength of character, he bowed to the mob, abused his position, and undermined the integrity of Parliament. Conventions cast aside, the Speaker's legitimacy destroyed, and democracy denied.
And let's also remember in the context that Suella Braverman, our Home Secretary, was sacked because she was putting on pressure onto the police to actually do something about the hate mob, which is this kind of Palestinian marches that have been happening on our streets of London and throughout the United Kingdom ever since October the 7th. With incitement to genocide on our streets that, you know, we've both seen it. It feels like literally like you might as well be in Munich in the 1930s at a Nazi rally. The level of hatred for the Jewish people there, for Israel, is just beyond horrific. And of course, what this has done, and there's that direct correlation, is that you are giving these people freedom to march on our streets, freedom to shout and call for genocide, aligning themselves with a genocidal terrorist organisation that is Hamas, that is committed to Israel's destruction and the destruction of the Jewish people worldwide. And you're in solidarity with them, and they literally threaten of the very value systems that we adhere to in this country. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of press, freedom of thought. And all of these go into making up the democratic traditions that have been handed down to us from generation to generation to generation. And now what we're seeing is that these have been thrown in our face as the Islamists are taking firm control of our nation and using the police, using weak parliamentarians, using any means to push their control and their agenda is scary. So at least we have someone like Suella Braverman who is willing to put her neck on the line and willing to speak up for truth, not only in this very powerful article that she writes in the Daily Telegraph, but also her role when she was Home Secretary, because she understood it. She understood what's at stake. And sadly, I think with Keir Starmer and with David Cameron and the others, they don't have that deep level of understanding about the dangers and the peril this nation is in, because we've allowed Jew hatred literally to become like a Pandora's box that threatens to destroy our everywhere of our life, all our cherished values, because we need to stand up to this tyranny.
You mentioned the police and how these hate mobs are using the police, and indeed the police in London can at best be described as naive and ignorant. That's at best, but at worst, and I think in many cases far more accurately, completely powerless and impotent to deal with a situation they have no grip on. We have calls for intifada in the streets. Intifada revolution, there is only one solution. A chant I videoed and around all of these teenagers and people just hopping about in keffiyeh, you know, thinking, you know, this is great. What are they calling for, Simon? Intifada. These kids, first of all, haven't seen an intifada. They don't know what an intifada is in some cases, but in most cases they do. They know. You type in intifada, what is intifada? What do you see? You type in intifada, the images show up immediately of bombed out cars, of bombed out cafes, harkening back to the infiltration attempts back in, well, there have been 2 intifadas already, yep. But what we see now is immediately following the 7th of October, which people in most cases will be aware of. They're rebranding this and reframing this as somehow a legitimate act of resistance. Or we're hearing some people say, well, I don't endorse everything that happened on that day, but we can't separate what happened from a broader context. And there's this whole completely false alternative historical narrative which demonizes the Jews, that demonizes, and they'll say, no, it's just the Zionist. Okay, well, you know what? 94% of Jews are Zionists. That's a statistical fact. You can look it up. 94% claim to be Zionist. Every Jew in Israel is a Zionist. And there are multiple Christians who are Zionists. There are Arabs in Israel who are Zionists. And so the reality of the facts is just completely cast off. And if it weren't for the Community Security Trust, I dare say, Simon, we would not have any accurate picture of what's going on in Jewish community, or any understanding really of the immense amount of hate that they're facing as a result. And look at these images that we've been showing up. Here's a placard that invokes blood libel demonstration in London, and the police have routinely, they're tagged on social media and said, well, will you not deal with this? And the truth is, when I approached one a police officer who was standing idly by while they were harassing people, he said, well, you know, they're not getting physical with anyone. They're saying what they're saying peacefully. You might disagree with it, but okay. So if I, God forbid, was to stand outside a Saudi bank or something in Kensington, Knightsbridge, there's one right across from Harrods, I think. If I was to stand outside there and get a group around and start chanting anti-Saudi or anti-Islamic slurs at people, how long would that last? I would be carted off, rightly so, within 5 minutes, right? But when it comes to the Jews don't count.
No, but they do count, and that's why this program matters, and this is why this topic matters, because you know, we are judged depending on our treatment of Israel and the Jewish people. And when we see that pandemic that we have in Jew hatred, that 2023 is the highest recorded instances of Jew hatred on record, then this is extremely disturbing. But let's have a look now at in the United States. Thanks to our friends at CBN, also show how levels of Jew hatred in America are also skyrocketing as we see these the gates of hell were literally unleashed on Israel on October the 7th, and now Jewish communities around the world are reeling.
Statistics show that anti-Semitism is as high as it's been since the beginning of the Nazi movement.
It's a major threat for Jewish communities. We see that Jews are afraid to wear the yarmulke or the Magen David and to go out on the street. We have the case of Paul Kessler, a professor who quietly raised an Israeli flag in the streets of LA and was brutally murdered by pro-Palestinian protesters.
Israeli government minister Amichai Chikli handles issues relating to Jews worldwide. He recently shared a report on this dramatic rise and focused on key incidents of 2023, mainly the murder of Jews and Israelis in the U.S., Tunisia, and Egypt, and U.S. university presidents arguing that calls for genocide of the Jews did not violate their code of conduct. Chikli tells CBN News much of this can be traced to universities receiving funding from foreign states like Qatar and organizations promoting terror and jihad.
I think we need to examine what's happening in CARE and other Muslim Brotherhood-related organizations that possess a threat not just for Jews, but also for any other civilian, and especially for the ideology and the values of the Judeo-Christian civilization.
He also echoed cause for alarm within the Palestinian Authority.
Mahmoud Abbas, who says that Hitler exterminated the Jews not because of their religion, but because of the social role and financial business. This is basically Hamas almost medieval blood labels.
The focus of growth, however, comes back to the United States, which recorded some 45% of worldwide anti-Semitic incidents since October 7th.
So today the U.S. became the center of anti-Semitism. In terms of the cases that we are facing, we know that this is also the largest Jewish community outside of Israel.
The greatest weapon, though, is social media, which reaches across borders.
We've seen an increase of 1,200 anti-Semitic content that calls for violence against Jews. These are not just posts against Jews. These are posts with a specific intent to commit a violent assault.
Chikli says Israel is changing its strategy from defense to offense, including countersuits against Hamas for war crimes, exposing anti-Semitic indoctrination in UNRWA and the Palestinian Authority, such as its pay-to-slay program, which rewards those who murder Jews, and pressuring governments, decision-makers, and financiers to freeze or put conditions on aid to the PA, UNRWA, and similar organizations. A key reminder that he emphasizes is that the Hamas attacks on October 7th were not just against Israel.
It's against the Jewish people and also against, I think, the Western civilization. The jihadist, the global jihad agenda is not just related to Jews and it's not just related to Israel. It's the Western civilization as a whole.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, we know that this program is a difficult program, and of course we hope that viewers will understand that there are going to be conversations and images that you may find distressing. Could I encourage, whenever that happens, you bring it to God and that you cry out for His mercy, that you pray for the peace of Jerusalem, that you use that as a catalyst to increase and enhance your prayers to the Lord on behalf of the Jewish people. Simon, we've seen horrifying scenes outside our center of democracy, the Houses of Parliament. We saw imagery broadcast just projected onto Big Ben and Stephen's Tower that's there, saying "Free Palestine, from the river to the sea," all of that. And there was no interaction, there was no intervention from the police. There was no permission for it, that was clear, but there was no intervention whatsoever. There was a van that had been rented by the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, and they were driving by the area with images from the 7th of October and images of hostages and whatnot, as they often do. That van was mobbed by people shouting and swearing and hating on it. And it's just an indicator that Parliament is under immense pressure. The members of Parliament are under immense pressure. The SNP had put forward this bill calling for an immediate ceasefire. Labour actually, to their credit on this occasion, their amendment that they presented, which is normally not allowed, it's normally a bill presented that the government can respond to. Yep. Speaker Lindsay Hoyle broke with convention and accepted the Labour amendment as well for the SNP, which called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. It's not a permanent ceasefire, but one that essentially has already been, to some degree, had previously, allowing for release of hostages. They actually did mention release of hostages. They mentioned that Israel cannot be expected to stop unilaterally unless Hamas does as well. It was the first time I've actually seen Labour sound a little clearer on what a humanitarian ceasefire entails without putting all of the responsibility on Israel. It was lacking severely. It was corrupt in so many ways, but you know, you take what victories you can, I suppose. Yeah, but SNP hated it, stormed out. The others stormed out. Labour, you know, the amendment was voted on. But the reason they did this, the reason it was allowed, is because you have so many Labour MPs who are literally in fear for their lives, who, if they had voted against a permanent ceasefire, which the SNP is calling for, they would continue getting death threats and might even be murdered.
Well, this is the toxic environment that we're living in now. This is the toxic political climate. I mean, the fact is that we have Hamza Youssef as the First Minister up in Scotland. He's got family in Gaza, or they've been brought to Scotland anyway. Indicates where his heart is and where his loyalties lie. So, of course, he will want to win over the kind of Muslim voters in Scotland ahead of the general election. We see that Labour Party has a huge problem with Jew hatred within their party, and we see that I think the evidence is clear that not much has really happened since Keir Starmer has become leader of the Labour Party. Even though he's vowed to rid the party of Jew hatred, we see that it's and to change the party from its toxic leadership under Jeremy Corbyn when he was leader of the Labour Party, how Jews within the Labour Party, within the movement, and also including Jewish members of Parliament, felt very threatened and very scared to be Jewish within the leadership of his party. Keir Starmer said, right, we're rooting out this, we're going to get rid of all the anti-Semites within the party. And then, of course, October the 7th kicks off in his face. He's been very strong up until recently, and now he's calling for a ceasefire, and he's changes his mind as he has done on everything else and done a major U-turn. But the danger is, as we head into kind of a general election, that so many of the Labour Party constituencies and those MPs hoping to get re-elected have huge Muslim majorities. And one issue that they're all pretty much united on is their support for the Palestinian cause and Israel's expense. So when we see, for example, there's a vote in the House of Commons on whether Israel should have a ceasefire, firstly, it's not up to us in our parliament to decide whether Israel should have a ceasefire or not. It's up to the Israeli government, and it's up to the Israeli Defense Force to make their own military and political decisions in the best interest of the state. We know that they're doing this because of the pressures within the SNP, within the Labour Party, to have a vote on a ceasefire to show that they are giving legitimate concerns to their own constituencies within the political parties. But effectively, this means that the Islamists have hijacked the SNP and the Labour Party, and this is essentially a threat on our democracy. She goes on and says this about, this is Suella Braverman in her article in The Telegraph. She says, trust was shattered by Starmer's grubby background deal. The mask has slipped. In hock to the Islamists, he is responsible for one of the most shameful displays of our democracy. By effectively taking the Speaker hostage, he brought Parliament into disrepute. This is the behaviour of tyrants. Just imagine what Starmer would do as Prime Minister. The truth is that the Islamists, the extremists and the anti-Semites are in charge now. They've bullied the Labour Party. They've bullied our institutions. Now they've bullied our country into submission. But what is our response? Our leaders bury their heads in the sand, preferring the illusion of a successful multicultural society, terrified of being called racist. But the law has not changed. Mass extremism parades itself proudly. Campuses remain a dangerous place for Jews, and Labour is still rotten to the core. Let's not forget how, in the short term at least, we got here. On October the 7th, an Islamist death cult attacked one of our closest allies on a scale never before imagined. More than 1,200 citizens of Israel, the vast majority of them Jews, were butchered in their homes, communities and a music festival. Many of the women were raped and then murdered. Another 250 people were kidnapped, taken back to terrorist lairs where many still languish. We're told that Israel, in its noble mission to recover those poor hostages, must cease. In its defence, forces must put away their weapons. Let's hear from those naysayers, both inside and outside Parliament, the alternative practical solution first. But this isn't just about my colleagues in Parliament. Our values and our freedoms are under attack in all walks of life. What is happening to our great country? That one which was respectful, welcoming, and where speaking your mind didn't mean losing your job or your life, where different faiths and races coexisted peacefully. I remember that country, but that's not the Britain I see now.
We cannot accept defeat, Suella Braverman says. We need to find our courage, but we can only do that with honesty and determination. That's why we must resist the attacks against the PREVENT program, designed to tackle extremism in whatever form it takes and stop people being radicalized into terrorism. It has been labeled Islamophobic and racist because, in the main, it is set up to tackle the most dangerous terrorist ideology facing our country, which is Islamism. And, Simon, if this is not the kind of statement that we would want to be seeing from someone as a prime minister, I don't know what is. This is the exact sort of language that we would be desiring to see from our prime minister. It's clear, it's courageous, it's to the point.
It's moral courage.
Exactly. And yet we're seeing neither of our candidates, essentially, if we're looking at more or less two parties that are going to have the majority of the seats, showing the same sort of courage. We see a pandering, we see a sitting on the fence, we see a silence. Rishi Sunak has expressed unequivocal support for Israel. Keir Starmer has wavered on his support for Israel, but has previously expressed it. But there's not this sort of condemnation of this extreme threat of Islamism to the health and well-being of our social structures.
Because they're running scared. And also, I think we have to put David Cameron, our new Foreign Secretary, into the mix there, putting pressure on Israel to call for a ceasefire, but also then to also calling for a Palestinian state. After what Israel's been through on October the 7th, they're in no mood to allow for the creation of another kind of failed Arab state that's likely to be controlled by Hamas if there's free democratic elections. So, yeah, well done, David Cameron. I think this is essentially that we have to realise that Israel is on the front line in this war against this demonic evil ideology, which is Islamic fundamentalism, that represents Hamas, that represents Hezbollah, that represents the Iranian regime, that represents Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or the ideology of the Houthis, that of ISIS, that of Al-Qaeda. Yeah, this is the darkest demonic ideology that actually threatens our way of life. And of course, at the heart of this, just like Nazism, is Jew hatred as its founding ideology. And where we see that, this is why we need to stand up for it. And of course, Suella Braverman has been standing up for it. And this is what she says about the government's PREVENT program. She said, the government has failed if 75% of MI5's caseload consists of Islamist terrorists, yet the proportion of Islamists referred to PREVENT is only 11% and failing. It's not Islamophobic to challenge Islamic fascists, it's a civic duty. Says none of this is easy. I've written about how the protests could be policed better. Others have set out how we can clean up campuses, mosques, councils, and more fundamentally, how we can promote better integration. I may have been sacked because I spoke out against the appeasement of the Islamists, but I would do it again because we need to wake up to what we are sleepwalking into, a ghettoized society where freedom of expression and British values are diluted.
Where Sharia law, the Islamist mob and anti-Semites take over communities, we need to overcome the fear of being labeled Islamophobic and speak truthfully. Enough of the hand-wringing and apologies, Suella Braverman concludes. Turning a blind eye to fanatics has got us into this terrible situation. It needs to stop. This is a crisis, and the fight back must start now with urgency. If we're to preserve the liberties we cherish and the privileges this country affords us all, if we're to have any chance of saving our country from the mob. And this follows in the wake of a pro-Israel member of parliament facing an attack on his life back in January. On the 31st of January, the Conservative MP Mike Freer quit frontline politics after death threats. The Justice Minister was targeted with suspected arson attack and has been subject to intimidation over his pro-Israel views. According to the Daily Telegraph, he announced he's going to step back specifically because of those death threats and intimidation and that he was experiencing, saying he was lucky to be alive after narrowly escaping a meeting in 2021 with Ali Harbi Ali, who later would murder his fellow MP, Sir David Amess. And an interview with the Daily Mail, the 63-year-old said he had been subject to a decade of this intimidation. This isn't new for him, culminating in a suspected arson attack on his constituency office in December. With family being concerned by the incident, Mr. Freer decided to step down over Christmas.
And it says here that Mr. Freer is not Jewish, but has voiced strong support for the Jewish community and his constituency of Finchley. And Golders Green has a large Jewish population. He says, I'm a strong supporter of a two-state solution, he told the Mail. I'm not completely Israel come hell or high water, but yes, I do support the Israeli government on the eradication of Hamas very firmly and very robustly. He also said that many of his constituents have faced anti-Semitism after October the 7th, Hamas attacks. He says, I know of no other schools that need security other than Jewish schools, he said. I don't know places of worship that need security. I don't know shops. Shops might have security for shoplifting, but not to shop, to stop their shoppers being attacked. And so therefore we also say that also, the Daily Mail calls upon members of Parliament to stand up to the Islamists. They say that there's disheartening news that Tory MP Mike Freer is to quit Parliament following a decade of intimidation, death threats and an arson attack triggered inevitable soul-searching in Westminster. It says here, according to this Daily Mail editorial, the Commons Speaker called for a nicer politics. The Prime Minister said the campaign against his colleague was an attack on democracy. MPs expressed concern that civilised debate was now being drowned out by the shrill of voices of hatred. Something must be done, they all agreed, but what is it? The fact is that this problem will not be solved until the country confronts rather than indulges the Islamist threats. Mr. Freer has been hounded by Muslim fanatics and was targeted by an extremist who murdered MP Sir David Elms, and they said that since 2017, Britain has suffered at least 6 Islamic atrocities. 2 secular London schools have recently suffered mass protests and been threatened with bombing of the Muslim hardliners. These are the actions of a violent minority of religious extremists who loathe Britain's liberal values and tolerance and want to topple them. How has it come to this? He says, our politicians and institutions are too often cowed to political correctness, to act against minorities who flout our laws and our cultural norms. Multiculturalism has seen too many Muslim families insulated from the wider British society, their communities becoming petri dishes for extremism. While since October the 7th, attacks on Israel, the police have failed to clamp down on anti-Semitic thuggery, which has encouraged Islamists to flex their muscles.
We now have a special news report from our friends at CBN. We've been talking a little bit about the UK Parliament and the fiasco we've seen here in our British politics. Well, the Democrats are divided now in the US as progressives in Congress are blasting Israel for battling Hamas in Gaza.
The warmongers are out, y'all. They are ready. They want to kill and not stop. It's pure insanity.
Michigan Democrat and Congress's only Palestinian American, Rashida Tlaib's rhetoric and participation in this recent pro-Gaza rally at the Capitol has been met with swift backlash. Members of Tlaib's own party have pushed back against her stance, and an effort led by Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene to censure Tlaib failed this week. She's now also seeing attack ads in her congressional district, like this one from Democratic Majority for Israel.
Her legislation will allow the terrorists to rearm themselves.
Missouri Democrat Cori Bush, another squad member, has also spoken out against the Israeli response, posting on social media, "We can't be silent about Israel's ethnic cleansing campaign." Her own party leader, Hakeem Jeffries, rejected the accusation.
Israel is not conducting an ethnic cleansing campaign. Israel is not engaged in genocide. Israel was brutally attacked in the most horrific way on October 7th. It has resulted in the largest loss of Jewish life since the Holocaust. And Israel is in a position where it is responding and going after Hamas. That is a necessary and urgent project for it to complete. At the same time, we are, of course, going to make sure that we are providing the humanitarian assistance necessary to Palestinian civilians who may be in harm's way.
Both House members could end up facing primary challengers because of their actions, with a Democrat Political Action Committee looking to potentially back opponents. While President Biden has stood firmly behind Israel, the progressive divide comes as Congress weighs military defense packages. Thursday, the House took up a $14.3 billion bill, with the GOP seeking to offset the Israel funding by rescinding money to the IRS.
It's been kind of disturbing to us. I've heard Democrats suggest that there needs to be a ceasefire. Let us be clear. We've been very clear about this. There was a ceasefire. It was before October 7th, and Hamas broke it, and Israelis suffered unspeakable acts of evil, as you've heard even recounted here this morning. Israel doesn't need a ceasefire. It needs its allies to cease with the politics and deliver support now.
Analysis by the Congressional Budget Office determined lost revenue by the IRS cuts would actually add to the national debt over the next 10 years. The Democrat-led Senate will likely pair Israel and Ukraine aid, and House Democrats want defensive support for Israel with no strings attached.
That's why this House should send a clean bill to the Senate. Instead, Speaker Johnson is willingly jeopardizing Israel's security by making support for Israeli assistance contingent on issues totally unrelated to its security. He's taken an unprecedented step, and one with potentially fatal consequences.
12 Democrats ended up defying leadership and helped pass that Israel aid package out of the House. Although some did openly admit they didn't like the IRS cuts, Jared Moskowitz, a Florida Democrat, said he could see the political mailers now saying you chose the IRS over Israel, and he wouldn't take the bait. Matt Gelka, CBN News.
Excellent report there by CBN. And of course, we know that Israel, the whole issue to do with Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, could play a major role, not only in the US presidential elections in November, but also in our general election due to take place anytime throughout 2024. And also we see that intervention by Lord Mandelson, who's known as the architect of New Labour. He's also got the nickname the Prince of Darkness, and without him we wouldn't see Tony Blair rise to power as he did in the late 90s. So it says here that Lord Mandelson left a synagogue early on Sunday night, according to the Telegraph, after a row broke out over anti-Semitism within Labour. And it came after the record of Sir Keir Starmer, the party leader, was criticised during the event at the Hampstead Synagogue in northwest London. Says the awkward scenes unfolded at the annual Isaiah Berlin lecture, following a speech by Sir Anthony Seldon, the historian and author, entitled "Has the Job of the Prime Minister Become Impossible?" Mr Johnson said anti-Semitism hasn't been a factor in British politics really since the 1930s. But now very much is, and Keir Starmer told us he'd sort out this problem in the Labour Party. He said, but it's very obvious that he has not. So what do you think about that? I mean, he will undoubtedly win the next election, but I think many people in this room will feel very uncomfortable about voting for a party that is still clearly marred. He says before Sir Anthony could answer, Lord Mandelson, sitting in the front row, interjected, "Oh, that's disgraceful. It's disgraceful to say that."
Mr Johnson replied, "Well, it's true. Look at Rochdale," a reference to Labour having suspended Azhar Ali, its by-election candidate, after he made a series of anti-Semitic remarks. Reacting furiously, Lord Mandelson shouted, "It's a nasty smear, a really nasty smear. I'm ashamed of you." Some members of the audience applauded, but others stayed silent. Mr Johnson responded, "You are investigated by the EHRC. No other political party has ever had that before." To which Lord Mandelson asked Mr Johnson, "Do you not have any sense of knowledge or decency, Daniel? What do you think he's done since that report?" Now, there is a very real danger that Azhar Ali, the former Labour candidate referenced there, will win the Rochdale by-election on Thursday on an anti-Semitic ticket to win the Muslim vote, even though he is up against the notorious George Galloway, another individual who has expressed views that he would say are simply anti-Zionist, but that we would say are actually anti-Jew. Sir Keir Starmer has made its his pledge to root out anti-Semitism within the Labour Party and distance itself from its previous anti-Israel leader, Jeremy Corbyn. This was working until the horrific events of October the 7th. Starmer stood firm on his support for Israel and refused to give in to Islamist pressure to call for a ceasefire and condemn Israel for its war of self-defense against Hamas in Gaza. However, he's wavered on that significantly. And in the past 2 weeks, he has unturned all of this by calling for a ceasefire and a two-state solution. The danger is he is now beholden to the Islamists and the anti-Semites with the Labour Parliamentary Party and grassroots of his party.
Absolutely, and this is the danger, that what we offensively could see come the general election is a Trojan horse. I don't think the Conservative Party have done themselves any favours in terms of the way that they've governed this country. But the danger is that if Starmer wins the next general election, and he'll win it by default, not by giving the country a vision and a plan of how he wants to govern the country through the Labour Party, all it's going to take is one major political crisis and a challenge to his leadership. And we could see someone from the hard left or the Corbynistic wing of the party take over, and they would then be beholden to the Islamists, and then effectively then they would have control of our government and institutions of state. This shows you how precarious the times in which we're living in, and how much we need strong leadership, how we need people to stand up and actually call a spade, to deal with the threats that our nation is facing direct on, and doing more to stamp out Jew hatred in this country, because by stamping out Jew hatred, we also stamp out on the rise of Islamism on this country and those who are peddling this hate against the Jewish people, because it's not just the Jewish people that's attacked, but it's our very freedom, it's our democracy, it's our Christian faith, it's our nation that is effectively subjected to and subverted to by these Islamist forces. So the big question as we come to the end of the programme now, Regan, is are we now living in the times of the season of the hunters? As it says in Jeremiah chapter 16 to 24, I am now sending for many fishermen, in terms of Aliyah, Jewish people making Aliyah to Israel, says the Lord. They shall catch them, and afterwards I will send the hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and every hill and out of the clefts of the rock. And if you see the prior verses towards that, it really does talk about the Jewish people coming home from the land of the north, which we've seen in the 90s. So what we've seen now really with this, and I thought we were at this stage about 2014 with the rise of ISIS, but literally I don't think anything could have prepared us for this pandemic of Jew hatred that we're seeing today.
It's a very clear-cut case of watch and pray and act. We who are in Christ need to be aware that there are promises still being fulfilled. Yes, ultimately we find the fulfillment of everything in Christ, yet there's still much to be accomplished, and the Lord is still working out His perfect plan leading to the fullness of time. I believe we are approaching that period of time the Scriptures speak of as the fullness of the Gentiles. I believe we are seeing the fullness of remnant restored to the land. I believe we will continue to see the following of Jesus as Messiah soar throughout the land of Israel. The numbers are really escalating of people who are turning to faith in Yeshua as Messiah. And I believe that in the midst of all that, we are going to see an amplification of Jew hatred. We're going to see people manifesting this demonic, satanic, influential spirit, whether it's in politics, whether it's in our church congregations, whether it's in prayer meetings, where some of the most, what you would think, unexpected places, you'll be seeing this manifest in and out of people. And it's our responsibility pastorally, those of us who are in places of leadership, to speak clearly and confidently and courageously out and against it, whatever ill may come. We cannot and we dare not leave our post. The passage of being set as watchmen on the walls comes to my mind, we must continue to be faithful, and we can't sit on the fence when it comes to these issues.
And it does feel like, you know, we are reliving the 1930s, but this time in the 2020s. I mean, we have not seen the magnitude of Jew hatred since the 1930s and 40s, especially after the horrific events of October the 7th, has literally created this spirit of Jew hatred. Now has become a pandemic. It's gone mainstream. It's in our culture. You can't pick up a newspaper without reading 2 or 3 news stories that are relating to Jew hatred. It's dominating our parliament. It's infecting our police. It's like this spirit has literally taken over our nation with devastating consequences, and we're beholden to it. So until we kind of pray this through, and until we actually fight in the spirit regarding this, and until we actually stand up for righteousness, our nation is in peril. Our nation is in real danger, and I think this is a prophetic warning to our nation and to our leaders to wake up and realise that if we don't stand with Israel and the Jewish people, then the spirit of Jew hatred will come after us. And this feels like exactly what's happening today, Regan.
And it's so critical that we who are in Christ continue to open up God's Word and hear it speak to us, that we see it clearly for what it is. It's so important that we call a spade, that we speak what is good, right, and true. And that means approaching this with a sense of God's righteousness and justice, that we highlight the evil of Islamic terror that we are aware of and acquaint ourselves with if we aren't aware of the evils of Islamic ideology, and that we understand there is only one who is God, who is the Savior and Lord of this world, and we must be faithful to turn to Him. Well, that's it for us on Behind the Headlines. Thank you so much for joining. Tune in next week for another edition of Behind the Headlines with Simon and Regan.